Welcome back to the channel and to our Volkswagen Diesel powered Chevy S-10 project. As you can see, this truck is ready to go, and at this point in the project, we really should be gathering data on this unusual engine swap. But as most of you folks know, at the last minute in this swap, we discovered that the transmission has issues, which kinda sucks. So today, we're going to replace the gearbox with another T5 transmission from a 1988 Chevy S-10. This replacement transmission came from a very honest seller on Facebook Marketplace, and the condition is basically unknown. However, it's presumed to be good. So that's something of a worry, but we'll give it a try and see what happens. So the problem with the current transmission is it wants to pop out of first gear as soon as you let off on the clutch, which is not good. But sometimes you can hold it in first gear, and if all the gizzards in the transmission line up, the truck will actually move. However, most of the time, even with a significant amount of pressure on the shifter, well, it'll just pop out of first gear. In other news, the replacement instrument cluster arrived, and now we have a working speedometer and fuel gauge. Now this is interesting. This guy here is the interface that goes between the speed sensor on the transmission and the speedometer. Without this in the circuit, well, the speedometer won't work at all. You see, this gizmo was attached to the original PCM that came with the truck, and it's a signal conditioner that feeds both the PCM and the speedometer the right kind of signal. Now, underneath the truck, we do have a leak that's coming from the tail shaft seal on the transmission, but that's not really a problem since we'll be replacing the transmission anyway. So this is basically of no concern. However, we do have an oil leak under the engine, and that is a concern. This is a new leak that just cropped up, and I think I have it figured out. It's both easy and difficult to fix. You see, the leak is most likely coming from the O-ring around the dipstick tube. Unfortunately, it's impossible to see with a camera, but with the right lighting, you can sort of see the leak, and it's definitely in the area of the dipstick tube. I don't know what this thing is, but it looks scary. I'm no bug expert, but I don't recall seeing these things in Michigan, so it must be a Kansas type of bug. I think I'll leave it alone. Anyway, with the right equipment, swapping out the transmission is theoretically a 45-minute job. Basically, all you have to do is remove the 4 bolts that secure the gearbox to the bell housing and slide the gearbox out. At that point, you can slide the new gearbox in place and it's easy peasy. Of course, that's with the right equipment. Unfortunately, I don't have the right equipment, and on top of that, I have an injury to my left arm that prevents me from lifting anything heavy for the next few months. So the only way I can do this transmission swap is to pull the transmission along with the engine and replace the transmission when it's out of the truck. Yeah, it's a lot more work, that's for sure, but at the same time, doing it like this will not cause further injury to my left arm. You know, sometimes being human sucks. Anyway, when it rains, it pours, and a new problem cropped up when I finished wiring in the alternator. Now, for some reason, the oil pressure alarm is going off constantly, which is alarming. I double-checked everything, and at this point, I need to replace the alarm with a real gauge to see what's going on with the oil pressure. So, before I pull the engine and transmission, I have to install an oil pressure gauge to make sure we don't have a problem with the engine. Everything's a problem these days. So this is the oil pressure sending unit from the Volkswagen engine, and basically it's a pressure switch. If the oil pressure is okay, then the switch inside this thingy closes. So on our engine, whether the engine's hot or cold, this thingy doesn't always seem to work right. So the switch could be bad, or the engine's bad. I hope it's a switch. Anyway, I have no way to test this thing on the bench, so I'm going to ditch it and ditch the alarm system I installed and replace it all with a real oil pressure gauge. This electronic gauge that I'll be installing has an alarm built in, so one way or another I'll have an alarm. The good news is this new gauge will match the other 2 gauges that I installed last week, so that's good. This guy was sort of expensive and it cost a whole $35. Now, when it comes to oil pressure gauges, I prefer electrical gauges over the mechanical gauges because in the past, I did have a high-pressure nylon tube on a mechanical gauge fail. So this is just my preference, and I'm sure a lot of folks prefer the mechanical gauges. Anyway, this is the analog sending unit for the gauge, and instead of an on-off switch that the engine was originally equipped with, this unit will send an analog signal to the gauge so the gauge can display the actual oil pressure. Now, this sending unit has a 1/8 inch NPT thread, which is common on a lot of aftermarket gauges. However, the Volkswagen uses a 10mm by 1.0 thread pitch for the oil pressure sending unit. So, we're going to need an adapter to mate this sending unit to the Volkswagen engine. This is a 10mm to 1/8 inch NPT adapter that I got for a few bucks, and it's the right way to install an aftermarket gauge on a metric engine. This kit comes with an extra long harness that's pretty much plug and play, and all we need to do is connect power and ground to the harness and we're good to go. Fast forward a little bit and I have the sending unit installed. This engine actually has two oil pressure sending units. The one on the oil filter housing is the main sensor and it monitors the pressure right out of the oil pump. The other sending unit is on the back side of the cylinder head and it monitors the oil pressure in the head. In theory, we should be connected to the cylinder head location for true oil pressure. However, the alarm was triggering on this sensor previously and that was with the engine hot or cold. So my interest right now is whether we have a pressure problem right out of the oil pump. Okay, the engine's cold, let's check the oil pressure at startup. So 80 psi cold is not bad at all. It's certainly high enough not to trigger any sort of alarm like we were having before. And after 5 minutes of runtime, the pressure dropped a little bit, but it's still fairly high. This leads me to believe that the original sending unit was bad, and we don't have an oil pressure problem in the engine. Now keep in mind, this is the oil pressure right out of the pump and not the cylinder head pressure. The concern that I had was the original sending unit was indicating low pump pressure, and as you can see, the pump pressure ain't bad at all once the engine warms up. So the probable cause for the oil pressure alarm was likely due to a faulty oil pressure sending unit. At this point, I can begin the arduous task of removing the engine and transmission, and once the engine's out of the truck, then I can have a better look at the O-ring around the dipstick tube. Fast forward a bit and the front clip is completely off the truck. Removing the sheet metal is an extra step that most people don't do, but on this truck it makes getting the engine out so much easier. On a lot of modern trucks you actually have to pull the cab off to work on the engine, so this ain't that bad. And after a few hours, the engine and transmission are out of the truck. I pretty much did this without putting any stress on my left arm, although I did have help with this and that, but for the most part the cherry picker did all the work. Anyway, now I have easy access to the transmission, but right now I want to have a better look at the O-ring around the dipstick tube. So this is a close-up of the dipstick tube. Now, in a regular Volkswagen, it's real easy to see because the dipstick is out in the open on like a Golf or a Jetta. But in our case, the custom motor mounts on this S10 conceal most of this stuff, and it's extremely difficult to see. Now, with the engine out of the truck, I can get a much better look. Yeah, it looks like the O-ring is not properly seated. That's interesting. Anyway, this is an easy fix and I'll pop the O-ring back in place. At least now I know where the leak was coming from, and should it happen again, this can be dealt with the engine in place, so no worries. Apparently the dipstick O-ring is also a common problem, and it's where a lot of these engines leak. Let's deal with the transmission next. So the bolts that hold this gearbox to the bell housing are a combination of both hex and Torx. This bolt on the upper right side is one of those impossible bolts. I had to use a box wrench to get it loose, and if you use a regular socket to take this bolt out, well, the socket will get jammed against a nub on the transmission case. So in order to get this guy out, you have to use a Torx bit. I'm sure this makes sense to somebody, but not me. Okay, with all 4 bolts out of the gearbox, it should really slide right out of the bell housing, but that's not the case today, and the 2 parts are stuck together. You know, if I tried to pull this gearbox out while it was still in the truck, the fact that it's stuck to the bell housing would have really pissed me off. It's not supposed to be stuck. Why is it stuck? Well, it took a while, but I finally got the transmission separated from the bell housing. Future Jimbo here. Sorry to interrupt, but as I was editing this video, I had an epiphany of sorts. You see, the answer to separating the gearbox from the bell housing was right in front of me the whole time, and I didn't see it. I'll explain that in a moment, but first, let me explain why the gearbox was stuck rock solid to the bell housing. Well, it's real simple. This steel ring had developed a slight amount of corrosion, and basically that corrosion bonded the steel part to the opening on the bell housing. In a perfect world, these parts should separate with little to no effort. However, a slight amount of rust will actually glue these things together. Now, like I mentioned, if I was under the truck trying to separate the gearbox from the bell housing, well, that would be a bad situation. You see, I had to use extreme measures to separate the two parts, and that was only possible with the transmission out of the truck. But it turns out it's actually simple to separate the trans from the bell housing when they're stuck together. If you were paying attention before, well, I mentioned that this was an impossible bolt to get out when using a socket. It turns out I think that was intentional by whoever engineered this transmission. Let's try an experiment with the old transmission and the extra bell housing. Now, as I loosen this bolt a little bit, the socket will bump up against a nub on the gearbox case, and that's a bit frustrating if you don't know the secret behind this. I think this feature is to be exploited if the gearbox is stuck to the bell housing. Check this out. If I continue loosening the bolt, it'll force the gearbox away from the bell housing. That's pretty clever. This feature will apply pressure to break the bond between the steel ring and the aluminum bell housing if there's a bit of corrosion holding them together. You know, when working under a truck, there ain't a lot of space for extreme measures, and this would be more than enough movement. Anyway, at that point, the gearbox could be wiggled off the bell housing. On the other side of the case, there doesn't appear to be the same feature, but it may be possible to use a deep well socket and a little bit of this and that to apply pressure from this side if necessary. Of course, I have no idea if this feature was intentional or it's a design flaw, but if you're desperate, it may be the trick to get the trans off the bell housing if they're stuck together. Well, let's get back to the regular Jimbo and listen to him complain about more stuff. I tell you, that guy definitely needs a vacation. Well, it took a while, but I finally got the transmission separated from the bell housing, and I'm ready to install the replacement transmission. Unfortunately, this gearbox is way too heavy to lift with my injury, so I'll have to wait till my buddy stops by. With two people, it should be pretty easy to slide this back into the bell housing. Fast forward a little bit and the transmission's installed. It took two older people 15 minutes to do the job that a teenager could probably do in a few seconds. Well, it's in now and that's a relief. Now, in the near future, this damaged transmission will get a full autopsy and possibly repaired. I ordered the special snap ring pliers that are required to disassemble the thingies, and as soon as they arrive, I'll dig right into this thing and perhaps we'll figure out what was wrong with it. I've watched many videos on YouTube, and I think I know what to look for. It'll be interesting to see what the problem actually was. In the interest of saving time, it made sense to source a different transmission than to attempt a repair. If our new transmission turns out to be good, which I hope it does, then I can take my time with this transmission. Fast forward many hours and the engine's in and it's running again. So far, so good. No leaks and no weird noises. It's kind of boring. Anyway, the engine's been running for about a half hour now and the cooling system's fully purged. The truck is more or less ready for a ride, but let's see if the transmission even works. So before it was popping out of first gear. Well, that's very good news. The thingamajigs inside the gearbox seem to be getting along, and at this point, the transmission seems okay. That's quite a relief. Well, I think we should take this out for a ride, but first, let me bolt on a few more parts in order to make the truck look more normal. Halloween's over, and there's no point in scaring the locals with this rig. Okay, that's good enough. This is as normal as it's going to get right now. Obviously, there are a million things that need to be done both inside and outside the truck, but that can be done off camera. I'm sort of running out of time and I need to verify that the transmission really works. Reverse works, not too shabby. Let's try first gear. Very nice. So I think we did it. The transmission feels great and so far no issues. Now, despite the Volkswagen Diesel engine only having 54 horsepower on a good day, this truck drives fine. It's actually fun to drive, if you can believe that. I have the heater blower motor hot wired and it's a bit toasty in the cab. However, the engine temperature is very stable and it's hovering around 170 degrees Fahrenheit. The little diesel engine actually sounds like a much larger engine. It sort of inspires confidence. Who would have thought that a tiny Volkswagen diesel engine would make this truck sound so cool? Ah, the train from Stubbsville's making its daily run. You know, each of those boxcars are packed full of stuff that are on their way to the other place that they go to. It's fascinating how trains work. The way the transmission is geared, first through third gear are perfect for this engine around town. The truck moves without any effort, and I reckon it ain't using much fuel either. It's just a happy little truck with an angry sounding diesel engine. Ah, downtown. You know, it seems like every town in Kansas has some sort of grain elevator silo thingy. Let's go down Main Street and see if we can impress the chicks. Meh, no chicks today, although it is fairly busy. Well, I think we're finally on the right track. We had a few problems here and there, and with a little bit of extra effort, we got the truck to the point where it's drivable without too many parts falling off. Yeah, the door paint doesn't match the rest of the white paint, but hopefully the blue bed isn't too much of a distraction for some of you folks. It'll all get fixed, no worries. So a longtime viewer of the channel, Frederick, and his lovely wife sent over a surprise gift, and it's this awesome decal that I can now proudly display on the S10 pickup. I really appreciate when viewers tune in every week and occasionally send stuff to the P.O. box. It's always a nice surprise to find a gift or two. Thank you, Frederick, and of course the missus. Anyway, the transmission was a bit frustrating, and that was definitely something that I wasn't expecting to replace. Although, the previous owner did say this thing had a bad transmission. The wonky looking wagon wheel is actually the spare tire for the other S10. The good news is I have a replacement tire ready to be installed and it'll match the other 3 wheels. I'll get that sorted out this weekend. Under the hood, well, I still have to button up a few things and get this truck ready for its first real road test. Given how nice this thing drives around town, I'm really excited to take it out on the back roads and see how it does. Plus, we're going to see how this little engine performs on the expressway. That'll be a first for this channel. In theory, this rig should be able to keep up with traffic, but that's just a theory at this point. We'll find out soon enough. Thanks for tuning in this week, and I appreciate all my subscribers and of course patrons. We'll see you next time. Until then.